There's no better feeling in poker than calling the river with a below-average hand and watching your opponent reluctantly turn over a bluff. Players who are able to make sick river calls in big spots often seem like they know exactly what hand their opponent has. But is it really all about reading another player's soul, or is there some science behind it? Let's find out. First, let's establish exactly what we mean by hero calling, since it's a bit of a vague term, and being specific is always helpful. We're only going to be using the term to refer to river spots, since that's what most people think of when it comes to this concept, and bluff catching on the earlier streets is a much more complex topic anyway. Every river spot where one player has a somewhat polarized range and the other has a more condensed range is going to feature a certain amount of bluff catching by the non-polarized player, for theoretical reasons I'll explain in a moment. Many of the bluff catching hands in these spots are going to have approximately 0 EV as bluff catchers. They're going to be mixing calls and folds at equilibrium because the EVs of folding and calling are the same. Calling with these hands is very reasonable in many spots, and there are plenty of circumstances where even a slight tendency to over-bluff on the part of our opponent can lead us to always call with these hands. However, this isn't a massive adaptation away from equilibrium, so it doesn't really meet the definition of hero calling. Instead, we're going to focus on the spots where we might consider calling with a hand which is actually a pure fold at equilibrium, one which has such poor equity or card removal properties that it's usually supposed to be a snap fold, but instead we're going to peer into our opponent's soul, call the river, and win at showdown. In order to figure out how to hero call profitably, we need to have a solid understanding of the theory behind bluff catching, so let's dig into that a little bit. Some of these concepts may already be familiar to you, but even if so, it's always good to be reminded of how it works. In theoretically correct or GTO poker, we're supposed to be bluff catching every river spot a given percentage of the time based on villain's bet size, in order to stop them from being able to profitably bluff with any two cards. This hypothetical frequency is often referred to as minimum defense frequency, or MDF for short. Also in theory, villain is supposed to bluff the river at a certain rate as well. The percentage of bluffs in their range should equal the pot odds they're offering us on a call, so that we have enough incentive to pay them off when they have a value hand. In turn, the hands we call with need to have above a certain percentage of equity at showdown so that we actually win the pot when villain is bluffing. Obviously, we don't want to call the river with hands which lose to villain's bluffs because that turns their bluffs into value bets and changes the whole equation. So overall, what's theoretically supposed to happen is that our opponent's bluffs and our bluff catchers all break even, while our opponent's value bets profit significantly, and our bluff catchers also make money when our opponent gives up on a bluff and surrenders the pot, which of course is supposed to happen sometimes as well. Next, let's start to move away from theory and into the exploitative realm. This is where hero calling starts to become a consideration. In practice, our opponents will sometimes end up over-bluffing. In other words, the percentage of bluffs in their range is greater than the pot odds they're offering us on a call. This turns all of our 0 EV bluff catchers into profitable calls. If we call with these hands, which we should if we think villain is over-bluffing, then we're essentially ignoring the principles of MDF and calling too much, because villain is offering us an opportunity to make far more money than we should theoretically be making. Because the margins here are very narrow, and the frequency a player is bluffing in theory will be very precisely determined according to the exact bet size being used, these adaptations become very binary in nature. If they over-bluff, we're now incentivized to call with every hand which beats their bluffs, while if they were under-bluffing, which we'll talk about in our next video, we would be incentivized to fold all these hands. Hypothetically, our opponent could exploit these adaptations on our part in future hands by simply never bluffing against us, and allowing their value hands to make a massive amount of profit by getting called more often. However, in most cases, if we're making an exploitative adaptation by deciding to hero call against a particular opponent, we're usually doing it without any fear of what might happen in future hands, since it's very rare that an opponent who exhibits a significant weakness in their bluffing frequencies will also be capable of accurately adapting to counter the ways that we're exploiting them. So this is how hero calling works. It requires us to identify a spot where we believe our opponent to be over-bluffing, or in other words, where we believe the percentage of bluffs in their range outweighs the pot odds their bet is offering us. But in order to apply this concept in a practical way, we need to think about the types of spots in which these opportunities might come up. And to help us do this, I've divided potential hero call spots into two categories, both of which are surprisingly common in practice, even though they're not necessarily easy to identify. The first category is spots where our opponent arrives at the river with a lot of potential bluff candidates in their range, and simply never shuts down their bluffs by checking back. Their range might be somewhat well constructed leading up to that point, but once they get to the river, they can't resist the urge to fire the third barrel. This might be because they expect us to overfold, or they're simply overly aggressive on average. This can also apply to spots where our opponent is overly aggressive on previous streets and therefore arrives at the river with too many bluff candidates to begin with, and then also fails to shut down. This can lead to spots where villain is over-bluffing by a significant margin, but it is somewhat less common overall. The second category is spots where our opponent arrives at the river with the appropriate bluffing candidates and does choose their bluffs effectively, but for whatever reason doesn't value bet thinly enough with certain types of hands. This leads to the absolute number of bluffs in their range staying the same while their value bets decrease, which increases the overall ratio of bluffs to value bets in their range, and pushes them above the optimal bluffing frequency for the situation and into over-bluffing territory. Both of these types of spots are ones where hero calling can sometimes be incentivized. So let's take a look at a couple of examples in GTO Wizard AI to see how it works. First, we'll take a look at what we'll call a Type 1 spot, where villain arrives at the river with a lot of potential bluffs and never shuts down. So this is the unlocked version of our spot here. You can see it's a 100 big blind MTT spot, hijack big blind, 10-9-5, 2 diamonds flop. Hijack's going to bet 2/3 pot and get called. Then on the 4 of spades turn, they're going to bet a geometric overbet size of about 1.4x pot. We're going to get a blank river, the 4 of clubs, and big blind checks to them, and hijack is going to jam. You can see hijack's jamming range here on river is very polar, obviously. We've got a value region right up here, all over pairs, and you can see mostly king 10 plus. King 10 is roughly right around the threshold where the value betting range stops. And then the bluffs are coming primarily from the king high and no made hand region, but a little bit of ace high in there as well. Even though ace high does have some showdown value, it's going to be little bits of stuff like ace 6 over here, little tiny shreds of ace king and things like that. But generally a fairly logical strategy, and the majority of the bluffs are going to come from this area over here, as you can see, as well as a lot of the king queens and king jacks up there. So if we look at the bluff catchers that the big blind is employing, you can see that the portion of range that's going to be indifferent here, which is going to be the portion that's mixing calls and folds, is right around this top pair and second pair area. As you can tell, king 10, queen 10, jack 10, these are all the hands that are beating all the bluffs, but are losing to most of the value bets. So this stuff is going to be very, very close to break even. The weaker 10x is going to be the same thing. It's going to be very close. 10-5 actually has 2 pair there, so it beats ace 10 and king 10. So that's actually a pure bluff catcher. And then 10-3 and 10 deuce, those hands are calling because they actually, having a deuce or a 3 in their hand, they unblock every potential bluff. Whereas all of this stuff up here blocks at least some chunk of bluffs. So that's the bluff catching protocol here. We're never calling with a 9 except for specifically mixing ace 9 of hearts and ace 9 of clubs, and then a little bit of ace 9 offsuit there. But generally, we're not calling especially wide. We're not really going too far beyond a 10, and even a lot of our 10x is actually folding here. Now, if we look at the locked version of this that I have prepared, we've got a very similar setup here of the value bet and bluff ranges for the in-position villain here for the hijack. Everything king 10 plus is going to be value betting, just for simplicity. We've got 10-9, 9s, 10s in there. We've got the pocket 5s, 4s, 5-4, etc. All the 4x, all the overpairs up here. Very straightforward. And then the bluffing region is going to be purely this no made hand and king high. So we've got everything that is bluffing is being drawn directly from this portion of hands here, this portion up here, and then a little bit of this stuff down here. And we've got villain following through with all of this stuff. So they are basically not giving up their king highs and queen highs very often. They're bluffing all of this stuff in full when they get here. And let's see what effect that has on the bluff catching protocols. Here it is. Here is the out of position strategy for the big blind. Take a look at this, right? The big blind is never actually folding, even ace high. And these hands that were pure folds before have now become pure calls. There's nothing that's mixing. Everything that beats bluffs is purely calling. Even stuff like 5-3 offsuit, all the weak hands and better, everything in all of these categories is purely going to call. There's no real need to worry about card removal or anything like that. And if we look at the EV margins, I have it set in percentage of the pot here, and we look at what kind of pot share something like a king 9 is making. King 9 is making about 13% of the pot here. So in a pretty big pot, 200 big blind pot making 13% of the pot, It's about 26 big blinds. That's very, very good in terms of a profit margin. So as a whole here, we can really expect that these hands are doing extremely well, and we're going to make a lot of money by snapping our opponent off with these hands because they're drastically over bluffing. So as a whole, every single hand that beats bluff catchers is calling, and you can see we're only folding 8% of the time, and it's because we have hands that just don't beat any of the bluffs at all. So to summarize this spot, in this scenario, villain was value betting all king 10 plus, which was pretty good. However, they're supposed to shut down with a good number of missed draws, which are mostly going to be diamonds and spades, while their hearts and clubs continued bluffing. In our locked version, they were betting the river with 114 combinations of hands overall, with around 50 of those being bluffs. That means that they're actually bluffing about 44% of the time here on the river. However, we only need 37% equity to call because we're getting 1.73 to 1 pot odds. So obviously, any one pair is going to have much more equity than this. It's going to have that 44% equity at least. So we should always call with every bluff catcher here, even the ones that are pure folds at equilibrium. There's no reason to ever fold any of them when villain is over bluffing by this kind of a margin. Next, let's look at what I'm going to call a type 2 spot, where the villain isn't value betting thinly enough. So our example in this case is going to be a very similar spot. We've got a 10-9-5 flop. Once again, same bet size, same formation, same stacks. This time the turn is the 7 of clubs, and the in-position player is going to bet 2/3 pot again. River is the 6 of hearts, it goes check, and in position has a pot size bet or a check. So as you can see, their strategy here is going to involve value betting pretty much all their 2 pairs plus, even a tiny shred of overpairs there. And then their bluffs are going to come from some variation of low pair, ace high, king high, and worse. So we've got a whole bunch of different potential bluffing candidates here. Primarily, if we sort out the trash hands, you can see it's going to be pocket 4s and below. We've got some ace 4 and below, some king 4 and below. And then we've even got little bits of ace king, king queen, queen jack, and some of this stuff around here. So a certain number of kind of Broadway region bluffs up there. So a variety of different bluffs, but crucially, we've got all of that 2 pair plus, except for a tiny bit of pocket 10s because it blocks top pair, blocks 2 pair, that all these hands are going to be value betting at a pretty high rate. Now, if we look at what the out of position response is going to be here, you can see that the hands that are break even or the hands that are bluff catching here are primarily going to be the top pair region, a little bit of third pair, even some 7x that unblocks some bluffs. But really the primary break even region or bluff catching region is going to be everything up here and everything across here. It's the 10x and then a little bit of this stuff down here, although because once again the 10-3 and 10 deuce unblock all the bluffs, they actually pure call. But generally we're looking at a 10 with a Broadway kicker as being the break-even region against this pot-size river bet here. So let's now shift over to an exploitative version of this sim, a locked version where we change villain's value bet region. So in this locked version of the sim, I have restricted villain to only value betting with their straights. As you can see right here, they're not betting their sets and 2 pairs anymore in this region here. They're actually checking back everything that is between third pair and a set. And then they're going to continue bluffing with this low pair, ace high, king high, no made hand region. So they're actually going to continue with all their bluffs at the right rates, but they're going to reduce their value betting frequency. And if we take a look at what the out of position player is doing, you'll see that once again, we're now in the territory where we're calling 96% of the time. In fact, we have almost no jams. There's 0 combos of jams here because we simply don't have anything that can actually jam for value. We don't really have jack 8 in our range anymore because of how we played the turn. So in the end, everything here is actually bluff catching, and the only hand that's folding is queen jack, it looks like. So really, we're back to this territory where we're bluff catching everything. And that means we're even bluff catching regions like low pair. We're bluff catching a 5 here on this river. We're bluff catching with jack 5, king 5, queen 5, all of that stuff. A 6, so something like 6-4 of diamonds. All of these hands, if we reduce villain's value bet range by taking out all of that 2 pair and set material, if we take out all of this here, these value bets, suddenly villain is now over bluffing because they're finding the right bluffs, but they're not finding all the right value bets. And that's why we end up hero calling with all of these hands. So to summarize this spot, villain was failing to go for thin value with their sets and their 2 pairs, but they are still finding some bluffs with hands worse than ace high. In total, they end up betting river with only around 42 combos of hands, but 19 of those combos are bluffs, which means they're bluffing around 46% of the time. Since their bet size is exactly pot, we're getting exactly 2-to-1 pot odds, which means we only need around 33% equity to call. And with the equity our bluff catchers have, we're way above that threshold, so we're once again calling with any hand which beats the bluffs. So that's it for this breakdown of the principles behind hero calling. Hopefully you can implement this in your game and find some good spots to soul read your opponents. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via Discord to get them answered. Until next time, thanks for watching, Wizards, and good luck at the tables.